Thanks for joining us, and thanks to the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, Dan Haley, for partnering to present this really important and large topic that I think a lot of us are interested in, obviously, and curious about what happened in the last week and a half and how we're going to be moving forward with what happened in Texas and our grid system and the energy usage that we saw working and failing in Texas and the mid-continent. So just a little brief on where this came to be. The Thursday and especially the Friday before Valentine's Day, we saw some really unique market conditions and historic market conditions in natural gas marketplaces, coming from a low, well, and John will dig into it, but a low supply and a high demand as freezing temperatures covered historically warm places. And the person that popped into my mind to answer all of our questions was Mr. John Harpole, as he was very busy managing his day-to-day duties. And what we've seen is a deadly situation come from the grid set up in Texas. While we were getting ready for this webinar, we saw an announcement on Twitter that 5 of the ERCOT board members have now resigned effective tomorrow. So their board chair, vice chair, and 3 other members have turned in their resignation effective tomorrow. So this is obviously a very dynamic situation. Just a little bit of housekeeping, and I'll turn it over to John. We are recording this webinar, and you'll see a link at the bottom of where you can go to view this later and share this with your colleagues, friends, family in the future. And then at the end, we will be taking some question and answers with John Harpole. So if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A down at the bottom, and we'll answer a few of those at the end as we have time. With that, I'll turn it over to Dan, and we'll get going.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chelsea, and thanks to everybody who has signed on so far. It is great to see everybody, and glad that we can do this. And thank you, John, for joining us. Obviously, as Chelsea mentioned, this is a fluid situation, so we appreciate John weighing in right now to kind of give us the latest. I'm going to read John's bio to all of you and introduce John to you, and then turn it over to him for his presentation. John Harpole is the founder and president of Mercator Energy, a natural gas services, brokerage, and energy market analysis company. Mercator assists both producers and end users throughout the United States in selling and sourcing natural gas supplies. Mercator also conducts specific research projects for client groups, exploring the impact of industry trends on various regional markets. Mercator's analysis on poverty and fracking was featured in a Wall Street Journal editorial and on Fox News. During his career, Harpole has provided strategic advice and counseling to independent oil and gas producers, power producers, major gas and electric utilities, hedge funds and energy traders, retail and wholesale energy markets, equipment vendors, and large energy users, typically at the CEO level. He has traveled to China on 2 occasions to instruct employees of PetroChina and members of the Central Party's Pricing Committee on the regulatory and marketing history of natural gas in the United States. It marked the first time a foreigner was allowed to teach a course to PetroChina marketing students. John is a COGA board member, so we're proud to have him as one of our board members. He has been married for 27 years to Lisa Harpole, and they have 3 children. And I am proud to present to all of you, John Harpole. Thank you, John.
And thank you very much, Chelsea. Thank you for coordinating all this. I do appreciate it. A proud member of COGA, and I think if I told you the number of years that I've been a proud member of COGA, you'd be surprised. I just want to start out by saying that no one is enjoying what's happened down in Texas. We all have a lot of relatives, a lot of friends down there. And this was really going on about 10 days ago. I think that my employees are still suffering seriously from some kind of post-traumatic stress, given the stress that was buried into 7 days of trading for us, 7 crazy days of trading, where you're dealing with prices that are oftentimes during the course of that, not worth a day's worth of gas, but in one day, about 6 months worth of gas in terms of value. So I kind of feel like right now, like a detective asking the coroner, what happened probably too soon. And so I just have to say, I've never seen anything like this in the 40 years that I've been in the oil and gas business. It was unbelievable. And I really believe, and I'll share with you today my opinion, that this is really something that's been 20 years in the making. Now you ask yourself, why would you take this on in the midst of all of this? This is an issue that occurred down in Texas, is something that I've been concerned about for 12 years. And it's really something that my company is involved in day to day. Now, to give an idea of the scale of Mercator, I have four employees, all amazing people. And we handle about 2 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day. I've got brothers and sisters that are not even quite sure of what I do for a living. But when I explain to them, we are basically travel agents for natural gas for both producers who are trying to sell it and industrial plants that are trying to buy it. We have clients from Louisiana to California. We had end-use clients in this 10 days ago that actually turned off some of their load so that they could turn gas back to the grid. And there was obviously a financial reason for doing that, but we have great clients. They're all very, very good friends. We've got producers, and I kid you not, one of the producers, when the prices started to fall from their historic highs, said, John, that's really a good thing, because those prices are not good for this industry. So none of us are enjoying this right now in our industry. None of us are celebrating. That concern that I had 12 years ago has come to fruition. And I'll do my best today to try to describe it to you without using industry jargon. Please know, on a housekeeping note, all of these slides will be available. And just for another housekeeping note, I may breeze through a slide rather quickly, but it will be available later on. I want to kind of change or keep the continuity of the story moving forward. So let's get it underway here. All right. Again, thank you for the opportunity, and for all those people that have tuned in, thank you so much for your attention today. I'll do my best to try to make this understandable. So what is the root cause of the Texas energy disaster? Click here. Unbelievable cold spell. Unbelievable cold spell. 15 consecutive days with below average temperatures, 3,000 cold temperatures broken from February 12th through the 17th. The first ever wind chill warnings issued by the National Weather Service offices in Lake Charles and Houston and Dallas. To get started, I kind of have to do some basic fundamentals of electricity. Ostensibly, electricity cannot be stored in any kind of utility scale. You're doing one of three things with electricity. You're either generating it, transmitting it, or distributing it to wholesale or retail customers. This is critical in the element in terms of what I'm going to talk about later on in terms of the cost of the different generators and their reliability as it relates to the power grid. But let's just jump into the thick of it right now. ERCOT is the only grid operator that does not operate a capacity market that rewards reliability during peak usage days. ERCOT relies solely on an energy-only market where generators compete on the price of the energy they produce. For power producers in an energy-only market, there's no penalty for failure to deliver during a peak day emergency. This market structure resulted in the largest forced power outage in U.S. history between February 12th and the 18th. Why would politicians and regulators choose this type of purpose-driven energy-only market that places no extra value on dispatchable generation during peak hours? I believe it was one of many incentives granted to wind energy. What's that? So who is ERCOT? ERCOT is the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. They are a nonprofit. We're just hitting our screen up here, folks. Be patient with me here. They're a nonprofit independent system operator, ISO, that's not a government agency and has no regulatory authority. They have four primary responsibilities: maintain reliability, facilitate a competitive wholesale market, facilitate a competitive retail market, and ensure open access transmission. Now, ERCOT manages the flow of power to about 26 million customers, representing 90% of the state's electric load. ERCOT doesn't cover the entire state of Texas, the panhandle of Texas, and portions of El Paso. The El Paso area are not included within ERCOT, but they are regulated by the PUC of Texas, and that PUC regulates all electric, telecommunication, and water and sewage utilities. ERCOT schedules power on an electric grid that connects more than 46,000 miles of transmission and 680 different generation units. Texans decided specifically that ERCOT would be an island to avoid federal regulations. Here's a map of it, and there's a quote from a professor at the University of Texas that's so appropriately Texan. There are 3 US systems, but in Texas, we like to say there are 2. There's our system and the non-Texas system. So they really operate as an island, and because of that, they can't rely on the Western Interconnect for power. They can't rely on the Eastern Interconnect for power exchanges during peak time periods. They are a grid operator, and there are 2 types of grid operators: an RTO, a regional transmission organization, and an ISO, the independent system operator. So days before, on February 9th, days before this storm, this historic storm hit, they spent about 40 seconds indicating that all was well. Now, this gives you an idea of how this storm caught them as a complete surprise, as it did many across Texas, many people in the energy business. ERCOT typically has a peak day, a day where they have the most usage in the summer. But I guess Mother Nature this time decided something else in mind, had something else in mind for Texas. Why not experience your peak day all time in the winter? So this is a great slide from RBN Energy, good friend Rusty Brazil, that shows the amount of power being generated and how it dropped off like a rock on that Sunday, the 14th, a day none of us will ever forget. Now, a lot of fingers have been pointed at different entities in terms of different electric generators: wind, coal, natural gas, nuclear. But this is actually how the supply moved between February 8th through February 16th. Wind energy was down 93% as a percent of the total. Coal was up 47%, and natural gas was up 450% as it related to the time period prior to February 8th. And what's interesting, if you look back on it, all of those generation resources performed as expected. And I think that's a critical thing, that wind performed as expected, natural gas performed as expected. There were no surprises. But because of that power drop in terms of total generation, Bill Magnus, I guess the former president of ERCOT, said they only had minutes to start shedding load, turning off access to their power grid to certain folks so that they wouldn't blow up the system. When I say blow up the system, so the system would not break down. They thought initially that this would be a short-lived rolling type of blackout, but that was not the case in some areas. Should they have been surprised? I would say absolutely yes. Here's a boundary of the Texas ERCOT grid, and you can see the outage intensity by county for that fateful Monday evening, February 15th. The darkest colored counties are those that are out 100% in terms of customers. So ERCOT, what happened? Why did this happen? ERCOT runs an energy-only supply auction. They've set up the grid and the market in such a way that it acquires large amounts of power through continuous actions. Every 5 minutes, power generators bid into the market, offering to provide chunks of energy at particular prices. ERCOT, in this auction process, fills that open need by selecting the bids that are the cheapest and that make the most sense from a grid management perspective. Every 15 minutes, those bids settle, and the highest price paid for electricity is accepted in that round. If a sufficient supply is not available, no power producer is penalized. Again, it's an energy-only market. If you don't show up with the power, there's no penalty involved. So in that system, some experts claim that the short answer is, in terms of who is to blame, was no one. There are actually experts saying that no one was to blame for this outage. Under traditional utility models, capacity models, generators who do not perform are penalized severely. Capacity-driven markets, which in basically every other RTO and independent system operator in the US use capacity-driven markets. Those markets account for the value of reliability and generation resources. So it's important to remember, ERCOT is the only grid market, or the only grid that's operated under rules that do not value reliability. They look at this energy only as their solution. So let's talk about comparative reliability. Nuclear plants have an 18 months of fuel on site. Coal plants can have as much as 6 months. Natural gas power generators can sign up for pipeline firm transportation agreements and supply agreements to have great reliability. The problem with wind energy and renewables, you know it well, the reliability is not very high. So wind, you have to remember, is an energy resource, not a capacity resource. It can only be turned down and off, and it's not dispatchable like fossil fuel resources. You can't call on wind and say, please turn on. So on February 12th, the Railroad Commission of Texas issued an emergency order. And to me, for someone that's been in the business for as many years as I have, this order was stunning because I thought that something like this would have been in place, but essentially they set a priority on human needs first and foremost, and electric generation facilities would serve human needs as the secondary level. I have never experienced any tariff or rules or regulations in any utility service territory that didn't always put home heating and human needs first. And so that this emergency order was issued February 12th is, again, I think another indication that they were not anticipating and never had the kind of Arctic storm that they saw there. Note, though, also that if a utility buyer lines up to buy gas and an electric generation buyer lines up to buy gas from one supplier, obviously the utility buyer wins, hands down. So there's a gentleman named Ed Heers who has been predicting the mess that ERCOT went through for years. He's an energy economist at the University of Houston, and he's my new favorite hero, primarily because when asked once about what he thought of a politician claiming that they needed to study the power failures, Ed, who doesn't mince words, said, no, you dumb bastard, you don't have to go any further than the bathroom mirror to figure it out. I pin this blame for this problem on the way this market was set up. And it was set up by politicians, regulators, bureaucrats, but clearly it's not a market that functioned properly during the peak time period that they experienced here recently. So again, why am I interested in all this? Back in 2009 through 2011, I was given a speech kind of all over North America, talking about how you actually integrate wind energy with all the fossil fuels that are running into the grid, that run the grid. How do you integrate something that's unpredictable in terms of its dispatchability? That wind really only shows up when it's windy. As you've heard this, I'm sure before, sun only shows up, or solar power only shows up when it's sunny. And so I've always said, you know, I'd never promised my daughter perfect weather for a wedding, a perfect sunny day, because it's unpredictable. Nor would I promise my son that we could go fly a kite two weeks from today. So that, again, wind energy, renewable energy is not dispatchable, is subject to weather. So the awareness of the irony of trying to mix not a unit of generation that's not dispatchable is not lost on many. This is a terrific quote that I used back in 2009 from a gentleman at MIT, that the nature of electricity markets, instantaneous matching of supply and demand, means that intermittent technologies are not perfect substitutes for any one of dispatchable technology. So years ago, Western Energy Alliance, it was called the Independent Petroleum Association of Mountain States, asked Bentech Energy to do a study on how you mix wind energy into the grid. If you look on this slide, you'll see coal on the upper left-hand side, the yellow dash line. And what happens to coal when wind energy comes on? Now in Colorado, when wind energy comes on, it's what's called a must-take resource. It takes priority over any other generation resource. And what we were curious about at Western Energy Alliance was what is the real CO2 impact of taking a coal plant that's running 24/7, 365 days a year, and turning that coal plant off to allow wind onto the same electric grid to balance the grid. Coal has to come off. what you see in the slide is that coal turns off, but as you know, with anything that's combustible, that fire doesn't disappear. And so the CO2 emissions continue for about 8 to 9 hours after you turn that off. And so what we want to do is measure, is there really any net benefit to wind energy in terms of reducing CO2 when you consider all the CO2 emissions that coal plant is spewing out while it's off the grid. And what we found out through this Bentech study, and thank you, Porter Bennett and Bentech Research, that there is very minimal, if any, CO2 advantage by bringing wind onto the grid with coal plants. Now, we had teased that this presentation and this analysis would come out, and 5 minutes after the analysis was released into the marketplace, the American Wind Energy Association, that was run by a friend of mine, Denise Bodie at the time, immediately had a report and a response saying that our study and our analysis was not worth it, was not worth the paper it was printed on. So again, this is why I was so interested in this issue 12 years ago. So let's go into this now. And these next few slides will be filled with a little bit of jargon, but hang in there with me. We're well on our way here. So what is the difference between an energy-only market and a capacity market? Will that answer help explain what happened 10 days ago in Texas? I believe it will. The issue really is one of a calculation called the capacity factor. And I'm reading to you here, but the capacity factor is the ratio of its actual output over a period of time to its potential output for that time. The capacity factor for a power plant is calculated by dividing the actual amount of electricity generated by the plant by how much electricity the plant could have generated the same amount of time at 100% capacity. So I bent to my good friend's suggestion, and I allowed Ricky Bobby to appear in this presentation. But my friend Robert Bryce, who is a nuclear to natural gas kind of a guy, will enjoy this. If you ain't first, you're last. But you see on the right-hand side of this slide, the capacity factor by energy source. Nuclear at 93.5%, natural gas at 56%, coal at 47%, and wind at 34.8%. So electricity production in the US is predicated on reliability and affordability, security. Large amounts of electricity cannot be stored efficiently or economically. Wind should be thought of as an energy resource, not a capacity resource. Wind can only be turned down or off. Two options. It can never be dialed up, obviously. So did Texas politicians stack the deck for wind energy? I believe they did. Here's a bit from the Energy Policy Act of 2005. The operation of generation facilities to produce energy at the lowest cost to reliably serve customers, recognizing any operational limits of generation and transmission facilities. Not all megawatts are created equal. This is a slide that kind of depicts wind generation through a day and what the load is for demand for electricity on the same grid. Unfortunately for wind generation does not correlate specifically well with electric demand. But you'll hear a lot of people talk about, John, don't worry about it, we're going to have electric storage. We do not, categorically do not have electric storage at what's called utility scale, okay? Electric storage for wind means batteries. And the comparative cost to store natural gas per unit per hour versus wind per unit per hour is as shown on the slide. 50 cents for natural gas, $200 for wind. So this is a tremendous slide from my friend Mark Mills. It would take 500 years for Tesla's current factory in Nevada, the largest battery factory in the world, to make enough batteries to store 1 day's worth of electricity needs for the US. 500 years. Furthermore, the world's largest utility scale battery in operation is located in Fairbanks, Alaska. 1,300 metric tons. It's larger than a football field. It can only provide electricity for 12,000 residents, or about 38% of Fairbanks population, for 7 minutes. That's useful for shortages, for outages, which happen in Alaska a lot, but it isn't effective enough to act as a reserve for solar and wind. But here's the real bottom line. As we move into this brave new world that many people would like us to, the amount of mining that would have to be undertaken to make the batteries that we're all assuming will happen, we'll see a 2,000 increase in mining. A lot of that in rare earth metals that are located in foreign countries. So it's not as if we're turning to our own cells for this energy security. We'd have to look to other countries and see a 2,000% increase in mining. So back to Texas and back to the Texas power outages. More than 4.5 million customers went without power. This is a specific map that looked at the February 16th at 10 a.m. for the outages. I had a very good friend down in Austin who was without power for 45 hours, which goes back to the point, what do you do? How do you recharge a battery that empties in 4 hours? And really, don't Texans deserve the same reliability that Google requires of its data centers? Google calls these things 5-9 reliability, where basically power is available 99.999% of the time. With that calculation, that only allows for about 5 minutes of interruption 1 calendar year. And again, think about that. People in Austin were without power for 45 consecutive hours. If you had a battery, how would you recharge that battery during that outage, the length of that outage? So here's an actual slide of the ERCOT generation mix from the 17th through the day of the 17th. The red is obviously natural gas. The yellow is solar. Wind is in the green. Very little hydro. You've got coal and then nuclear also. Again, everybody's pointing fingers, but all I can say is the experts agree that every generation resource behaved as expected. But remember, there's no penalty on this energy-only market if you don't show up with power. So let's delve into another regulatory term or phrase, and that's the planning reserve margin. This is the percentage of terms and amount of installed generation capacity on the system beyond projected electricity demand. This is kind of the cushion, if you will, of an extra electric generation that's potentially there during a peak time period. Okay, it's very important for these independent system operators or these RTOs to maintain a reserve margin that's acceptable for the very reasons, for the problems that occurred last week that we saw in Texas. Unfortunately for ERCOT, as compared to the other independent system operators and the other grid operators throughout the country, their reserve margin was the lowest in the United States. You can see it in the blue, dark blue bar as it's represented in the red box. Take a look at how ERCOT's reserve margin compared to other system operators across the country. You can get an even better look at it here and look at the assessment area across different parts of the country, PJM, MISO. But take again and look at what ERCOT's anticipated peak reserve margin was going into this winter. That's a problem. That's something that needs to be addressed. I'll talk a little bit about it more at the conclusion here. So let's step back for a minute and say, what's it like to be a gas-fired generator in Texas? One of the largest independently owned gas-fired generation is a company called Luminant. Luminant has 13 natural gas-fired generation facilities spread throughout Texas. It can produce at peak capacity as much as 10,246 megawatts of power, all fired by natural gas. This will give you an idea of the distribution of those power generators across the depth and breadth of Texas. And notice that many of these power plants are in the same area that was hit by record demand by utilities, record demand for utilities for home heating use, for those residential customers that were firing their furnace with natural gas. So let's go to the next one. I calculated how much natural gas supply based on that 10,200 megawatts that were available. I calculated how much Luminant might have to buy in terms of natural gas on a daily basis. Now the scale might be lost on you, so I'll try to help you out here. If you took a 7,000 heat rate, which is a calculation of how those generators would burn natural gas on average, they would need about 1,721,000 MMBTU per day, or what we call 1.7 billion cubic feet of gas per day. That's roughly, again, equal to what Mercator handles on a daily basis for about 40 clients. That's roughly equal to all of the cold weather demand in eastern Colorado, the Front Range of Colorado, on a peak day of demand. So 1.7 BCF per day, or 1,700,000 MMBTU, is a huge volume. So Mercator handles the natural gas transportation needs for a lot of our clients. So this issue runs right down our fairway. If you assume that the natural gas pipeline cost to get gas in that volume to that end user on a daily basis about 40 cents of your delivered cost of natural gas, multiply 40 cents times 700,000, 40 cents times that 1.7 BCF of gas per day. And Luminant, in order to ensure the contract delivery, the firm transportation contract delivery of natural gas, would have to commit at a minimum for about 5 years for $700,000 a day worth of transportation. When I say committed, they have to pay that whether they use it or not. So imagine the conversation if you're the natural gas guy at Luminant that's in charge of getting supply for this facility. And you go to your boss and say, okay, you know, I know the electric grid really only needs us about 30 or 40 days a year, but I need to spend $700,000 a day for a reliable supply. Can you imagine that conversation? So I really believe that one of the issues here that relates to the natural gas demand that was not there was not necessarily wellhead freeze-offs, but does Luminant, do all the other natural gas fired generators hold that very, very expensive firm transportation capacity day in and day out, hoping that when you combine that price to the price of gas and turn that molecule of gas into an electron, are you competitive in that 5-minute auction market, competitive against someone like wind energy? So my sense is that Luminant did not have firm transportation contracts lined up for their demand. And when they went out into the market and tried to buy gas capacity and gas supplies, they were competing with a buyer for the utilities that needed that same heating load, natural gas, that same natural gas for their heating load concerns. So a lot of competition between those two in a short amount of time. And I think that's a major contributing factor to why gas prices were bid up so high. So then take it a step further. Can you imagine bidding in that auction market, that 5-minute auction market, and you start in the hole of $700,000 per day, or even more than that because you haven't been able to use your transport because your competitive price could not compete against wind? Well, let me tell you, wind energy producers did not have to worry about connectivity issues to the grid, connectivity issues to their market. In fact, they said, look, we can't afford the billions of dollars to move wind energy from West Texas in a 3,000-mile transmission system to the population centers in Dallas and Fort Worth. And so the state legislature stepped up and created the competitive renewable energy zones, CREZ, if you will. They built 3,000 miles of transmission at a total of about $7 billion in cost to taxpayers. And every Texas ratepayer pays about a $3 to $5 per month fee, a CREZ fee, if you will, to pay down that $7 billion spent on allowing the wind energy businesses to gain access to the markets. Here's a transmission map of the CREZ transmission system. Again, 3,000 miles at just under $7 billion. What other subsidies did wind energy get? Well, basically run down to the total number. Look at the production tax credit, that's a federal tax credit. Look at the ITC, the investment tax credit. Consider that CREZ transmission lines that ultimately it's anticipated by 2029, it'll double in cost. Look at the federal stimulus funds. Wind energy in total, by this calculation, gets approximately $36 billion in tax subsidies. Who's eligible for the production tax credit? Here are a number of different parent companies who run wind energy farms throughout Texas. And look at the total dollars committed to this. So the effect of the production tax credit on competition to get into the grid and sell your energy is very difficult for natural gas fired generators. So wind is always typically bid in at the lowest prices. Even when wind is free, those wind energy developers still get a federal production tax credit of 2.3 cents per kilowatt hour. That's $23 per megawatt hour. So they can literally give the wind away for free. And as you bring more and more and more wind onto the grid, you find out that that incremental wind that's brought on causes the entire value of wind to be reduced throughout Texas. They're kind of eating their own, if you will. And what I've heard is that people say, oh, the cost of wind is coming down in Texas. Well, as that wind, quote unquote, penetration into the grid on a perfect wind day happens, you can see actually negative power pricing where you're paying the grid to take the power, and you can only do that, or you're only motivated to do that as a wind energy developer because of this federal production tax credit, PTC. So Andrew Barlow, the current head of the PUC in Texas, was quoted as follows: legislators have shown strong support for the energy-only market that has fueled the diversification of the state's electric generation fleet and yielded significant benefits for customers while making Texas a national leader in installed wind generation. As noted by the head of the PUC, an energy-only market can fuel diversification towards intermittent resources. It does this because it rewards only energy that is fed into the grid, not backup power. Well, guess what? Texas won the competition for most wind turbines. In fact, by a factor of almost 3 to 1, next to the second place position of Iowa, they have 28,000 megawatts, and this is a year-old number, roughly 28,000 megawatts of wind generation in Texas. So the PUC met. Now, what are the different factors that help drive natural gas prices higher? On Monday, February 15th, right at the outbreak of the disaster in Texas, the PUC met to address the electric pricing issue and decided to order ERCOT, who they have regulation over, to set prices administratively at the $9,000 per megawatt system offer cap during the emergency. They didn't believe that the market at $1,200 reflected where it should be, so they fixed the price for wind energy or for electric megawatts at $9,000. That's $9 a kilowatt for electricity is roughly equal, if you convert a molecule of gas to an electron, roughly equal to $2,640 per MMBTU for gas. So a gas-fired generator could go out and buy gas for $2,000 and still turn that gas molecule into an electron and make a profit. This type, I believe that this had some impact on the spot price for natural gas in Texas. As you'll see again, politicians tripping over themselves to say, hey, we need to investigate the natural gas industry to see if they were colluding to increase spot prices. Andrew Barlow for the Texas Public Utility Commission came out on the 15th and said, look, there was a glitch in the electronic system. And it was that glitch that caused electric prices to remain artificially low and not send the price scarcity message that needs to be sent to all the participants on ERCOT. And so Barlow said that this price has to be adjusted to the $9,000 level. So did Texas PUC action drive prices higher? You're going to see a lot of accusations that natural gas producers conspired to raise prices, and that could not be any more that could not be any more untrue, and I'll show you why. So we participate in a market on a daily basis here at Mercator that relies on an index price publication, a price publication put out daily by S&P Global Platts. It's a price assessment that measures all the different trades that are done for natural gas at specific points across the United States pipeline grid. And so I picked 3 of those points. The next 9 pages will address specifically those 3 points, and we'll look specifically at these 3 critical points to Texas, what the natural gas volume was on a daily basis, the number of deals on a daily basis, and the index that came out. And this is really presented here and now to kind of dissuade anyone from claiming that the natural gas prices were fixed and manipulated by producers. So let's first start with the Panhandle, Texas, Oklahoma Global Platts Gas Daily Index. If you look at the 3rd and 4th column, you'll see the volume of trades, and that's in 1,000 MMBTU, and the number of deals that transacted that were captured by Gas Daily, and then reported as the gas daily index price. You can see everything was normal February 5th at a $2.91 price. And then it went crazy on Valentine's Day weekend, President's Day weekend, only to return to normal prices, or what we characterize as normal prices on February 23rd. So that's the Panhandle Texas Index. Here's a graph that shows, represents that price about how normal it was. Storm comes, things go crazy, and the price returns. And this, for those of you that are interested, this is the specific location where that index price calculation is calculated. So here's the Waha hub. Again, February 5th, a $2.76 price. Look at February 6th, the volume traded was 1.2 BCF of gas per day on 187 deals. Jumped down to the 13th, prices moved from the day before at $11 to $153. 133 different trades, nearly 3/4 of a BCF of volume related to those trades. Here we are, February 23rd, return back to normalcy, $2.58. Again, reflected in a graph, that price spike. Again, exactly where those prices, you have to be trading gas there, you submit these prices to Gas Daily, they collect all the information and report it. So here's an interesting one though too. So we have the NYMEX Henry Hub that's located in Erath, Louisiana, that honestly did not move as dramatically, obviously, as all those hub and pricing points that are so close to that cold weather that Texas recognized. It did get cold down in Erath, Louisiana. In fact, there were parts of the Haynesville area of Louisiana that got 6 to 9 inches of snow. You can see the price skyrocketed for that area, February 17th and 18th. But again, it's returned to normal here on the 23rd. There it is reflected in graph form. So, and there's the definition of where those price calculations, where they occur and where they're collected by Gas Daily. So again, I just want to dissuade anybody who was thinking that there was any kind of gas price manipulation on part of the gas industry. The damages are horrific here. For people to die, for a young boy to die in his house after playing out in the snow for the first time is heartbreaking. The early estimate that you get from insurance adjusters right now is approximately $18 billion. They're saying that the cost of this may exceed many of the costs related to hurricanes down in the Texas area. But the cost on a personal level, there were 4 days of rolling blackouts. Empty stores, grocery stores went empty. You had boil water notices everywhere. I heard from one reporter that there were no crude oil exports because the export facilities had no electricity. And I got to tell you, in addition to wholesale electric companies that followed through, that fought through this, there are retail electric companies that sold natural or sold electric prices to their customers who are obviously going to be put out of business. And I'll show you more here in a couple of slides. But the exponential increase in gas and electric utility bills, and specifically how those affect low-income households that pay a disproportionate amount of their income, is frightening. I've got a niece that works for Atmos Energy, and Atmos Energy actually had to file a liquidity event notice on February 19th, called a Form 8K, where they came out and said, you know what, last week we had to buy somewhere between $2.5 to $3.5 billion. They did not know how much gas they had to buy for their residential users to within $1 billion. And again, to give you some idea of scale, the largest gas utility in the country is SoCalGas, Southern California, 5.5 million customers. Their total earnings for their residential revenue last year for the entire year was $2.8 billion. That's just an effort to give you size of scale. So there are retail electric marketers in Texas also. This DeAndre Upshaw got an electric bill to heat his 900 square foot house for about a week of $5,000. This is from the Texas supplier, retail supplier Gritty. And if you look up Gritty, you'll see story after story after story like this. So Governor Abbott just announced a couple of days ago that there will be no moratorium on power disconnects. You cannot kick somebody out for not being able to pay their power. He said he is trying to protect those people from being thrown out based on non-payment of power bills. So the electricity market unfortunately returned to normal also. About 9 p.m. on February 19th. That $9,000 price dropped down to 7 cents. 7 cents. And life for everyone. Fortunately, I believe all the rolling blackouts are gone. Life returns to normal. I just want to share a little bit with you with the rhetoric aimed at the fossil fuel industry. This is a quote, direct quote from former Vice President Al Gore. I'll let you read this quote when I get a quick sip of water here. This is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that said, the infrastructure failures are quite literally what happens to you when you don't pursue a Green New Deal. AOC's former chief of staff admitted to something that I think is extraordinary. This is a year and a half ago. The interesting thing about the Green New Deal is it wasn't originally a climate thing at all. Do you guys think of it as climate thing? Because we really think of it as how do you change the entire economy thing. Bill Gates just last weekend when he was interviewed by Chris Wallace says, you know what? We're going to need to triple the size of the electric grid. We're going to need to triple the size of the electric grid. Think about the cost to just put in 3,000 miles of electric grid in Texas at $7 billion. I think this would wreak economic devastation on the country. But I think everyone needs to wake up to this. For example, a 100 megawatt wind farm can produce power for 75,000 homes, but consider the cost in the iron ore required to build it, the concrete required to put it up in the air, and the plastic to build out the wind turbine. Is this the real cost of green energy? I think it's something we really have to take to heart. So questions for the inevitable investigators. What impact did the Railroad Commission prioritizing human needs, which they should do, over deliveries of natural gas to electric generation facilities, what impact did that have on the market and the price for natural gas? Were there any firm natural gas pipeline contracts to natural gas fired generators that went to interrupt it? Again, that priority for human needs is absolute. I'm not arguing about that at all, but what impact did the notice of that coming out on Friday before this happened have on the marketplace? What impact did the PUC have on the marketplace by fixing that wholesale price of electricity at $9,000? What was the system glitch that kept the market price at $1,200 when the commission ruled that it should have been $9,000? What was that system glitch? Is ERCOT's reserve margin, the lowest reserve margin of any grid operator in the US, a sign of a dysfunctional market that lacks proper market incentives for non-renewable generation facilities? Does the lack of a predictable market demand for fossil generators due to the ever-increasing market penetration by mandated and subsidized renewable energy generators? Does that keep new gas-fired plants from being constructed in ERCOT's territory? Is that the reason why the reserve margin is so low? Because you can't attract newcomers to a marketplace that clearly benefits one generator? Possible solution for you, we're almost done here. Until the reserve margin for ERCOT can reach an acceptable level, that level should be determined by the PUC. ERCOT should put in place fixed supply contracts with fossil fuel or nuclear power generators that call for a base load of volume of delivery during emergency peak needs. That includes a penalty for non-performance during peak periods. They have to do this. This is the only solution I see possible for going forward. And just to have to tease my wind brethrens, nothing says renewable like a helicopter powered by fossil fuel spraying de-icing agent made from fossil fuels on a frozen wind turbine. The conclusion, the ERCOT market disaster resulted from politicians and regulators pandering to the wind industry for the last 20 years. All the while, those bureaucrats created a systemic market of entitlement that requires no duty to perform. Given the market conditions, natural gas generators ramped up deliveries into the ERCOT system, a system that doesn't reward reliability. They ramped up generation by 480% during the most critical time of the emergency. The conclusion, the best indicator of this unfortunate truth that hit Texas is that no one individual or entity feels the need to apologize because no one is responsible. That is clearly an abuse of trust. This disaster was the result of a system environment that could only be created by politicians and bureaucrats, not by free markets. No one should have to worry about freezing to death in the winter in Texas. There should be, at a minimum, an energy security expectation for all Texans in such an energy-rich state. At the very least, those to blame should consider how their choices have impacted low-income households who pay a disproportionate amount of their monthly income towards utility bills. This is a slide. A friend of mine gave me a plaque, a presentation years ago. And I just think it's food for thought. I'll let you read it yourself. And again, I want to thank you for your attention today. Appreciate this. I'd like to get the word out on this opinion of what happened to as many people as possible. A recording of this will be available also. And I thank you. And Chelsea, I turn it over to you right at 48 minutes.
Great job. And thank you again, John, so much. I see we have a couple of hands raised, and we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A section. So I'd like to encourage you to put your question into the chat. I think we have time for a couple of questions, John, if that's okay with you, to answer those real time. If we don't get to your question, I think that there's an opportunity for follow-up, especially as this is a extremely dynamic situation. You know, as mentioned at the very beginning, we got notice that 5 of the board members of ERCOT submitted their resignation as of tomorrow. So I think that there is definitely more to come on this and more retrospective to be given on this, but really thank you so much for that initial look back. I know that there's a lot of us in industry that are grateful. But Dan, I'll let you ask the first question, and I'll find one to ask second, and then we'll follow up as needed afterwards.
Sounds good. Thanks, Chelsea. Well, your mentioning of the ERCOT folks resigning is a good segue to this first one. What do you think the likelihood of ERCOT or political leaders considering your presentation or your solutions? What is the likelihood that they would consider something like that viable, the solution that you put forward?
Thank you, Dan. I think it's critical to come up with a solution that guarantees a certain level of generation, and especially generation that will show up. And if it doesn't show up, it's penalized. I can't see any other way to, so it'll be a hybrid of what their energy only market is right now. But there are a lot of politicians, a lot of folks that have this vested interest for the last 20 years in making this, as they vote, a diversified market. Well, clearly that broke down. Clearly the trust of all the residential ratepayers, of all the people of Texas has been lost. The trust for the system has been lost. And so I hope they take that one solution that I offer into consideration. You know, there are a number of different ways that they can address that reliability factor, but the energy only market clearly is not the solution. So something has to change.
And John, if I can just follow up on that, it's to that same question. Kathleen Sagama asked, saying that your conclusion will not be shared by many. In fact, those opposed to free markets will take the opposite conclusion, which I think we're alluding to there. In other words, the Texas market should be even more regulated and have fewer free market incentives. She asked that you react to those opposite criticisms and why they're wrong.
Well, the free market in Texas did, according to their plan, provide lower prices over the last 20 years. You know, you would say that it provided lower prices, but there has to be some price put on trust and some price put on reliability. And I think you can solve this problem without having to re-regulate the entire marketplace. I don't believe that it's necessary to re-regulate the whole marketplace, but believe me, I agree with Kathleen. There are bureaucrats and regulators that would love to regulate. It was funny, one of the state regulators or state legislators was quoted a week ago saying, we don't have any authority over this marketplace. And I thought it was funny because that is the definition of deregulation, that some bureaucrat come in and just change the way you do business. So.
Thanks. We have another question here on the markets, and I think it relates specifically to Rockies gas markets. What do you see our natural gas markets doing in the short and long term because of this crisis? And does it have long-term implication for our markets? And it might be a play off of what you just answered for Kathleen. So what do you see this as being an impact for our producers in the DJ and the Piceance and in our Rockies region?
I've had this question posed to me at least a dozen times in the last week from our producer clients. And I believe what's going to happen here is that everyone in our marketplace, both on the gas side and the electric side, is going to start considering the reliability issue. I think you'll see utilities, natural gas utilities that purchase natural gas storage are probably going to purchase some, even though we're past the magical February 15th injection date. You're going to see some natural gas utilities inject natural gas into storage, even though winter is almost over. I think you'll also see those same utilities purchase natural gas at a higher level to put gas into storage during the next summer. So I really believe this winter event could have a positive effect on the natural gas price deck, or the natural gas price for the next year, to the tune of 10 to 15%. What it's done is expose a weakness in the system. So I think every utility, every pipeline will try to bolster the security of that system. And I think that means good things for Rockies natural gas producers. I'd love to just, while I can, a good friend who actually sent a lot of slides, he deserves a lot of credit. Ryan Zorn just pointed out that on an energy conversion, that 2.3 cents per kilowatt that you're seeing down in Texas now equates to a $6.70 MCF price for gas delivery. And so in that world, the 2.3 cent per kilowatt, natural gas producers can produce a lot of natural gas. That's a price that sends a market signal to go out and continue to drill and keep our daily deliverability numbers up.
John, we've got about 4 minutes left. Several questions here. I'll ask you one more. For the power outages, were all of the natural gas plants running at 100% capacity? Was there an issue getting natural gas to the plants? I understand consumption increased during the cold weather, but I'm wondering what power generation systems, wind, etc., underperformed.
Dan, I actually tried to place a call into the natural gas generator that I highlighted in my presentation, the one that has 13 plants that burn 10,000 MMBtu a day, because I really wanted to know, did you have firm transport contracts lined up? How much of the issue was not being able to get gas to your facility in a pipeline versus, no, I had that transport capacity signed up, and oh my God, it was freeze-offs at the wellhead. Those are the very things that are going to have to be investigated. My sense is that no generator, gas generator, can compete against wind and pay those prices for 24/7, 365 days a year transport. They just can't compete in a marketplace that requires them to be underwater, to the tune of $800,000 a day, hoping that they might, excuse me, be able to bid into the grid. So just in terms of folks not understanding how the system works too, this is sad if it weren't, this is funny if it weren't sad. But one Texas legislator said that he was going to legislate that it was illegal for wellhead natural gas production to freeze off. So apparently he thinks that, the laws of thermodynamics are something that they can amend in the state Texas legislature. Sure, there's plenty we can do at the wellhead, but only God and geology can control how much water vapor is in that gas stream as it comes out of that geologic formation. So I think it's just critical to try to educate, again, as many people as we can. And I really hope that this slideshow is something that's sent out and seen and used again and again and again.
Well, great, John. Thank you so much. And to your point, we do need to continue to educate folks, and that's what this was all about today. So we thank you for your time, the diligence, your insight and expertise. They were greatly valued. A lot of people on the call today. So thank you for doing that for our members. And I just want to thank everybody who joined us. I'll turn it over to Chelsea now to close, but thanks.
Yeah, thank you again. Thanks, John, for your time and your effort to put this together. I know we're all very thankful for that. And I know I learned a ton, and I know that there's a lot more to come from this.